So it's 4 o'clock and 30 seconds, and it's my charge and my pleasure and my privilege to say hello to so many friends from both sides and on both sides of the Atlantic. Let me welcome you very warmly to our webinar on Bases and Burdens, the impact of an American drawdown on nation, on NATO, on Germany, and on the United States. My name is Rachel Ellehuus. I am the CEO of the Hamburg-based ZEIT Stiftung, and the ZEIT Stiftung has a very long tradition of transatlantic work and transatlantic projects. This tradition going back to Gerd Bucerius, the founder of the ZEIT Stiftung himself, and to his early visits as a young member of the West German Bundestag to the United States in the 50s. For a long time, we, the ZEIT Foundation, and have been partners of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies. So I'm especially happy that we continue this partnership with Jeff Rathke and that we could jointly organize today's webinar. I thank my colleague Sascha Surke very warmly for this project. We are very lucky today that we could bring together a group of 4 distinguished panelists: Rachel Ellehuus from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Danielle Pletka from the American Enterprise Institute, Jana Puglierin from the European Council on Foreign Relations, and Wolfgang Ischinger, chairman of the Munich Security Conference, and for many, many years, dean of our Bucerius Summer School on Global Governance. Thank you all, Rachel, Daniela, Jana, and Wolfgang, for having accepted our invitation. My friend Jeff Rathke will moderate the session, and before I give the word to Jeff, let me just say how much we hope here in Hamburg for some profound changes in transatlantic affairs. I think that most of us agree with the US administration when they point at the fact that financially, we Europeans, and especially the Germans, do not pay the fair, the correct share of the burden. But the way this topic is dealt with does not comply to the way friends and partners discuss and solve their problems, their issues. There is much at stake, and we need respect on both sides. We need respect urgently. Perhaps civil society and its institutions, such as the AICGS and the ZEIT Foundation, can help to continue bringing friends together from both sides of the Atlantic, people who share a common sense of responsibility, people who share our common values. And with that in mind, I will give the word to Jeff now, the President, Director of the American Institute of Contemporary German Studies. And I am happy that so many participants have joined this webinar. So I think we are all very much looking forward now to our specialists and to our discussion. Jeff, it's up to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I want to express my gratitude at the start to the ZEIT Foundation and especially to Professor Michael Göring and to Sascha Surke, and really delighted to collaborate once again between AICGS and ZEIT Stiftung. I'm also glad to have so many viewers out there with us. We have four highly qualified panelists, as you have heard, and we have 1 hour. So let me tell you very briefly how we will structure today's event, and we will get right to it. For those of you listening out there, we are going to be using the Q&A function in Zoom today. We probably spend more time on video conference platforms than we would like, so everybody knows how that works, I think. And let me just say that because we have so many viewers today, there will be a premium on succinct and clear questions. The shorter and more precise your question, the more likely I am to choose it. So please keep that in mind as you think about how you want to contribute to today's discussion. And let me just set the stage in one brief minute. I think all of you are aware of the decision by President Trump in June to reduce the US troop presence in Germany to about 25,000 forces. This is not the first adjustment in US force presence in Europe. It has varied greatly since 1945. It reached a peak of over 300,000 during the Cold War and has been on a downward trend certainly since 1989. There have been two quite recent changes, actually. If you think about the withdrawal in 2013 of the last two US heavy brigades from Germany, that was during the Obama administration, and about a decade before, the Global Defense Posture Review, which was led by Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and which also dramatically changed the US posture, not only in Europe, but globally. So it's not the change itself, I think, that distinguishes this announced reduction in the US presence. I think it's the absence of a clearly articulated strategic rationale that has been developed through analysis and careful preparation. And so I think this is our opportunity to contribute to that discussion today. We're looking at a situation where the US presence in Germany would be reduced by about 12,000 troops. About half of those would come back to the United States and about half would go to other European locations. Consolidation of headquarters, including the US European Command, which under this plan would move to Belgium to be co-located with the NATO-shaped headquarters. The move of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment from Germany, which is the last brigade-sized permanently stationed unit in Germany, as well as move of the F-16 Fighter Squadron, the elements of the 173rd Airborne to Italy, as well as other changes, and especially an increase in rotational presence in Europe. Now, Defense Secretary Esper, when he announced the details of this, he characterized it as a strategic realignment that will better deter Russia and fulfill the US national security strategy by putting some of the US forces closer to the threats that the United States and our allies face, including in the Black Sea region, in Poland, and in the Baltic states. So I'd like to open by asking a question of Rachel Ellehuus, Senior Fellow at CSIS. You are someone who has dealt with questions of the US troop presence in Europe for quite some time. Senator James Inhofe of the Armed Services Committee in the Senate, he used very careful words when he described this, his support for this plan. He said, "It is clear to me that this concept will take months to plan and years to execute." Do you agree with that statement, first of all, Rachel?
Thanks, Jeff. And yes, I've been on the receiving end of a lot of these force posture changes, and I can tell you they're very complicated, particularly something that's international like this. You don't have just the US, you have the host nation, you have the receiving nations, you have families involved, you have costs. So there are a lot of considerations here in order for this to happen. So I would certainly agree with Inhofe's statement that it's months to plan, years to execute. And I'd also take the listeners back to General Hyten and Secretary of Defense Esper's remarks on the 29th of July. In their press conference, they characterized the reductions as more of a concept than a plan. So I think what we see next is EUCOM and the services and the functional commands that are affected here going to the drawing board to draft this phased implementation plan. I would also say that you really shouldn't see this as a whole set of moves that have to be taken together. They're better seen as a series of independent moves or individual decisions that can be executed over time and can even be adjusted or reversed if the situation changes. And again, Esper and Hyten said that their plan is subject to change and likely will change as EUCOM and the Joint Staff looks at this and as things evolve over time. Just to give you one example, when you were laying out some of the changes, one of the changes that's involved in this bucket of announcements is our RAF Mildenhall in the United Kingdom. And I remember back in 2014, 2013, the Department of Defense initiated the European infrastructure consolidation process that was meant to downsize our footprint in Europe and consolidate and find cost savings. under that decision, in which I believe was formalized in 2015, Mildenhall was slated to close. Now, under the current decision, Mildenhall will remain open, and the KC-135s that were supposed to go to Germany will remain. So I offer that example just to show how fluid this is. And so I really don't expect us to see the implementation of these announcements immediately. I think it's something that will be done over time. And as these considerations like cost and the impact on families, the absence or the presence of agreements with the receiving nations, as those become clearer, we'll see what is possible. You mentioned EUCOM and some of its components going to Belgium. We currently do not have a defense cooperation agreement with either Belgium or NATO. So that is something that would take time along the lines of what you saw when we were talking about increasing force presence in Poland.
So Rachel, two quick follow-up questions. First, is this going to save money or is this going to cost money?
Well, when Esper was pressed on the cost, their estimates were somewhere between 6 and 8 billion. You know, it's really hard to tell if this saves money. I remember under EIC, the European Infrastructure Consolidation that I mentioned, there were a lot of outlays in the near term. So there were costs involved in moving the forces back to the United States. There were costs involved in returning bases to the host nations or closing bases. There were costs involved in building new infrastructure for those families to return to in the US or elsewhere. So there are upfront costs, and if you don't follow through with the plan, you don't realize the savings. So I'm skeptical that this actually results in any sort of savings.
And I think it was also helpful the way you characterized these moves as a series of separate steps that would happen in different timelines. So how quickly could anything happen in your view? And what would those initial steps be, do you think?
So I think, you know, I look at these changes in 4 buckets. The first is a small bucket. That's the reversal of previous decisions. And I've already mentioned the KC-135 staying at Mildenhall. So that's something that we could bank because they're still there. They just don't move. So that's something that can happen quickly because it's essentially a non-movement. The second bucket would be decisions that are already in progress. So everything that we're seeing with Poland, despite how the press is characterizing it, are things that were already in planning in the Pentagon, including towards the end of the Obama administration, when there were discussions about increasing our presence in Poland. So a lot of those division headquarters that are moving forward, some of the rotational elements, some of the MQ-9s, which have actually been present in Poland since 2018, I think those will also appear to be increases, but again, already in progress. The third bucket are things that are returning back to the continental United States. Jeff, you mentioned the second CAV at Vilsec. I think the problem there and where things start to get difficult is where do they return to? Is there housing? Are there schools? Is there healthcare? Particularly in a time of COVID, there should be real concerns about making sure that those families and service members are our priority and have something meaningful to return to. The hardest bucket for me is the big moves, moving EUCOM and SACEUR to Belgium, moving AFRICOM to Italy, moving the F-16s to Italy, likely Aviano. And the reason I say that's the hardest bucket is because those are assigned forces. Some of the other ones are allocated forces. So for listeners who are not steeped in sort of posture speak, which is probably most, including myself at one point, you know, allocated forces are rotational forces that are on a short deployment. So you can move those around quite quickly. But if you have assigned forces, like the ones who are in Stuttgart at EUCOM and AFRICOM and SACEUR, they have their families with them. They are there and they plan to be there for multiple years. So they are a lot harder to move. And I already referenced the basing agreements that we would have to get in place with Belgium. Right. Just a final word on Italy. I mean, you know, all you need to do is sort of Google Italy and U.S. force presence to see how many difficulties we've had increasing our presence there and how public opinion in Italy may not necessarily be in favor of more U.S. forces. In fact, our defense agreement with Italy places a cap according to installation. So this could actually prove quite difficult. So I do not think those bigger movements from Vilsec or to Belgium or to Aviano are going to happen quickly, but some of those allocated forces could certainly move and appear to be moving quite quickly.
Okay, well, I think that puts us on a much firmer factual basis. Thank you, Rachel, for that perspective. Wolfgang Ischinger, I'd like to turn to you now. Chairman of the Munich Security Conference, former ambassador to Washington and to London, for many years a trustee of AICGS. What's the strategic impact, in your view, of this policy change on transatlantic security?
Well, Jeff, first of all, let me say how happy I am to have been invited to participate in this event. When I look at my association with AICGS over so many years, and it's just a pleasure to participate in this, even though it is, from a German point of view, not a happy story that we're looking at. First of all, let me make a fundamental point just to make sure there are no misunderstandings. I think I am certainly not the only one in Berlin who believes quite firmly that we Europeans cannot defend ourselves if a serious crisis erupted without the partnership, without the alliance with the United States. In other words, NATO and the relationship with the United States is an existential element of our security, of our collective security. This is why such decisions, such moves of troops from country A to country B have, of course, strategic implications depending on how you look at it. And let me make two observations. From a German-American point of view, we have always regarded the massive presence of US troops in Germany, certainly during the Cold War and beyond. It is now, of course, a much lower number, even before these announced changes, than used to be the case 15, 30, or 40 years ago. We've always believed, and I think we were right, in looking at the large presence of American troops, enlisted people, but also generals and colonels, as a huge asset for our bilateral relationship. Why? And I'm speaking as a former ambassador to your country. Why? Because literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of US servicemen and women over the decades have spent time in Germany and know where it is on the map, and they know where Frankfurt is, and they will be willing to tell the story that they have had a good time in Germany. In other words, we are, in that sense, we are happy to have had over decades a huge number of American citizens, American military people, who went back home to their home country, to the United States, telling a friendly story about the bilateral relationship. I used to talk to these veterans, and I always, called them my unpaid ambassadors. They've been a huge asset to the relationship. Seen from that angle, which is a historic angle today, it is, of course, a very unhappy situation to see that the small number of that the American contingent has been reduced to over the last couple of decades is now going to be even further reduced. First point. Second point, strategically speaking, my question, of course, is what exactly would be the view of our friends, the analysts sitting inside the Kremlin or somewhere else in Moscow? Do they believe that this whole event, the wording of President Trump's announcements regarding this decision, etc., will they look at this as a decision strengthening the credibility of the North Atlantic Alliance or not? And I'm afraid my own view is rather skeptical here. I think the message as received in Moscow is of disarray, is of lack of cohesion, is of a US-German disagreement, not only about burden sharing, but going far beyond that. In other words, I think from a Russian point of view, this is not an unwelcome decision. Third and last point, if we could say that this decision regarding the presence of US troops in Central Europe, Western Europe, Southern Europe, etc., is a reaction to ongoing strategic developments, then I would be the first to support this kind of movement. If we could credibly say, yes, there is a need for these fighter planes to be closer to the Middle East, etc. My impression is that unfortunately, the motivation of this, in the words of President Trump at least, was to express his dissatisfaction with the German performance in terms of meeting the 2% goal. And that would be my last remark. Of course, we are delinquent, and we should be very open about it. We have not met the 2% goal yet. Now, we were not supposed to meet it by 2020, but we're not in a very good position. So I will be the first to say that we should be doing a lot better than we have been doing in terms of increasing our own efforts on behalf of the alliance, but also on behalf of the European ability to participate in a credible manner in defending our countries, defending collectively the alliance, but also strengthen the ability of the EU in terms of developing military capabilities. So from my point of view, this is not one of our best moments in our bilateral relationship. I don't think it's a catastrophe, but it is unfortunately being exploited not only by, I would imagine, Russia, but also by anti-American elements within the German society. And that is something which I regret more than anybody else. I'll stop here for the moment.
Okay, well, thank you, Wolfgang. And I'm sure we're going to come back to several of those points in our discussion because they touch upon Germany's desire to take on greater responsibility, Germany's own defense capabilities and spending. So let me turn to Danielle Pletka, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute with expertise in defense and foreign policy, also a former staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so bringing that perspective as well. But Danielle, I'd like to ask you, can you put this in a U.S. national security context, maybe separate from the politics, if that's possible? How does this look from your point of view?
Thank you, Jeff. It's always such a pleasure to do things with your institute, and I'm so happy to be speaking with all of my colleagues. I can't believe you asked me to separate something from politics. I haven't done that in a really long time, and I'm not sure I can. But let me try and talk a little bit about this from a sort of an American national security perspective. I think the issue here for us is one of style and substance. And I want to say up front, before our little Q&A thing at the bottom of the screen there blows up with hate-filled questions towards me, I have no brief with the way that this decision was made by the Trump administration. I suspect that as Wolfgang said very aptly, it was motivated by pique and not by strategic considerations, and that is regrettable. On the other hand, that's also a conversation we've been having for the last 4 years, and frankly, it's a little bit boring. So let me talk about the style versus the substance. I think you always invite me to things in order to say things that wake everybody up. So let me try and say this in a way that will wake everybody up. You know, we have a marriage in NATO, and you know, for good traditional marriage people, we could think of America as the husband and Europe, our European friends, as the wife. For those of you who have other views, you can choose whatever role you want. But let us just say that there has been a group that has been undermining this marriage for quite a long time, and it is not the United States. Okay? It is a group that has chosen to have affairs with its social compact as opposed to its defense compact. It's a group that has chosen to have dalliances with its neighbors rather than with its defense compact. It is a group that has chosen to prefer its energy exigencies over its defense compact. And when we, the aggrieved party, stand up and take notice and say, gee, you don't really seem to have been investing in this relationship in quite the way you ought to have been, the response from our putative spouses is, we can't believe how rude you are. How could you speak to us this way? You are so impolite. You know, and the answer is, well, you know, for the last decade plus, more, 2 decades plus, you've actually been undermining this relationship, and I know you don't like it, but we finally noticed. Okay, now that is in essence the situation within NATO right now. Donald Trump aside, those are facts. Okay, we have invested in our defense, we have kept to our commitments, and most of our NATO allies, and particularly our friends who represent the countries on this call, have not. Okay? And that is a huge substantive problem. If you want to talk about what message that sends to Moscow, let me just tell you that sends a far worse message than us redeploying our troops. And again, I want to come back to what I said at the outset. I don't agree with how this decision was made. I want to make another point here on the style versus substance, because I think, again, Wolfgang really got to this very aptly, and that is, if this were a decision based on strategic considerations, it would be a very rational decision. Okay, my podcast co-host Mark Thiessen wrote a piece in the Washington Post that I didn't like very much that said Donald Trump is doing the right thing on Germany, basically because I don't like encouraging the president when he does things that I think are ill-considered. But Mark said to me when I criticized him, we're not defending the Fulda Gap anymore. We're not defending the Fulda Gap anymore. And the bottom line is that when Barack Obama redeployed our heavy brigades away, when George W. Bush redeployed our brigades away, there wasn't the kind of angry fuss that we're seeing now, this sort of petulance about how we were all propitiating Russia. That's one important point. The other is, what is the conflict that we are looking to? For the United States, the reality is that the difficulties that we face are geostrategic threats that are coming from China and Russia. They are not coming from Poland or Hungary. And so if we want to move our troops to a more opportune position, in fact, now is not a crazy time to do so. Again, we come back to, had this been a considered process, if this had been the end game of a considered process, our German friends might have been disappointed, because of course you will miss all of those lovely ambassadors out in Schweinfurt and all of those other halcyon places in Germany. But at the same time, our taxpayers would appreciate that in fact our troops were on the front line of our defenses. So, you know, again, style, substance. My argument would be at the end of the day that if we move aside the rhetoric of Donald Trump And we assess this based solely upon what our strategic exigencies are and what our partners in NATO have been willing to invest in the alliance over what we have been willing to invest in the alliance. This makes a hell of a lot of sense.
So let me ask you, Danielle, coming back to the marriage analogy, how far do you think one can take that? Because of course the United States gets its own benefits from its presence in Germany, you know, and so as we heard from Rachel, actually the cost of making these moves, at least in the near term, is going to be greater than any money the United States is likely to save. So you know, this is not just a romantic emotional partnership. This is one where the United States is getting a real return on the presence it has and the developed infrastructure and facilities it has in Europe.
Right, and I mean, I think Rachel made a fair point. If in fact we are responding to what Donald Trump said, which is that we're going to save money, but of course, you know, again, if we're talking about style and the rhetoric of the president, then you know we have to recognize that that's a bunch of crap. Okay? If we talk about the reality, then of course we do get benefits. We get, you know, look, the argument that all of us make, and I think all of us are roughly in the same position, those of us who are speaking on this call, you know, we all argue that our forward positions in Europe, that our NATO alliance has nothing to do with us being charitable to a bunch of other ingrates, but has to do with advantaging our defense, our interests, the reinforcement of our values, and the safety and security of the American people. That's absolutely true. This is not a money situation. On the other hand, you know, if you want to talk about friends with benefits, you know, we could get a lot more benefits from having friends in Poland. We could get a lot more benefits from having friends elsewhere. Again, the problem is not, the problem is that this is the product of pique with Angela Merkel about the fact that the president can't stand Angela. He just can't. Okay, and that's the problem with this. The problem is not that this would not be a rational thing to decide. You know, Wolfgang and I participated in a discussion about, I don't know, 2 months ago, in which we talked about the relevance of global institutions and the fact that there's been a lack of reform in international institutions that have ceased to serve the purpose that they were created for. You know, our emplacement of troops in Germany is a legacy of World War II. You know, for those of us who have been, you know, remembering 75 years, okay, it's not crazy to reconsider our presence in Germany after 75 years. It just isn't.
Very short question, Danielle. There have been a lot of Republican objections to the administration's choices as well. Do you think the support for this repositioning would evaporate like a morning mist if Donald Trump loses the presidential election?
You know, what's been interesting to me as I've tried to assess what the Biden administration would do, or a Biden administration would do, is that, you know, I think that a lot of things would remain in place, but the articulated rationale would change. Mm-hmm. In other words, we wouldn't be doing these things for the same reason. You know, every new administration does something we're all familiar with, right? Which is that they institute a review first. They say they're going to walk it back, but then they institute a review, and they often end up doing the same thing. That's a cause for celebration among those of us who believe in the importance of continuity in serious governance. I suspect that a Biden administration would hem and haw an awful lot, but actually would think very seriously about whether we need to forward place more troops in Poland and not in the former West Germany. Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to turn now to Jana Puglierin. Jana, how do you assess the response of the German government to these moves thus far? And maybe if you would like to offer a comment, because it's been mentioned that at least I think from President Trump's explanation, this is about punishing Germany for its failure to live up to its perceived failure to live up to its commitments. As Wolfgang pointed out, it's a 2024 commitment, not a 2020 commitment. But nevertheless, how do you assess the German response and positioning over the last couple of months and more broadly?
Thank you, Jeff. Maybe let me start with a small anecdote, and that's not about the German government, but about the German population. So it's been a year ago that I've been invited to a public panel discussion in the German Foreign Office on NATO. And kind of the Foreign Office opened its doors to the broader public, and all sorts of people came in and listened to us. And at the very end of the discussion, a young man came to me. He was about to finish high school and starting at the university. And he was asking me very seriously why American troops were still present in Germany. So he was not part of this people that Wolfgang Ischinger referred to that looked at the Americans in Germany as a huge asset. But he told me, so what are they still doing? What else are they still doing here? Why are they helpful? And why are they not why aren't they more of a threat for us than of an advantage? Because, the Americans are involved in all sorts of wars all over the world. And so maybe, I don't know, we get more terror attacks or something like that because we have American troops in Germany. And maybe that was an outlier, but I think there is a growing generational divide over the question of kind of the transatlantic relationship and NATO and all this. And you see this gap also between kind of the Berlin bubble and the government and the broader public. For example, when you look at the Körber Foundation poll, the Körber Foundation does an annual polling. They ask the German population about their opinion on foreign policy. And this time, 45% of Germans said that the American bases are not important to German or European security. And so I don't want to be cynical, but I think the masses of Germans are not really concerned about all this, as long as they think that the country is not exposed to any military threat from the outside. And I think this is all due to a large failure of politicians to communicate why the troops are there and to explain it to the broader public and to make the link to our own security. But I mean, we have a public opinion that is not very much in favor, let's put it like this, of the American bases. Of course, that's different when you talk to the people where the bases are, because it's also a huge factor for the local economy, and they are the mayors of, I don't know, Grafenwöhr and Vilseck are very concerned to see the American troops possibly leaving. But for the broader public, this is a different discussion. And even more so because, of course, I mean, all the political parties, except for Die Linke, have criticized the decision. They talked about a provocation. They said this is Trump's reckoning with Germany. They said it's kind of punishment. And of course, they took it personal and said this is because of kind of Angela Merkel and Germany. But they were also very quick in telling the Americans that it was not in their interest to move the troops, that it was about their security too. And so I was just astonished by the amount, by the degree of kind of, of which the German politicians were quickly to say, oh, this is weakening the transatlantic alliance, and the Americans are shooting themselves in their own foot and saying that this affects their kind of ability to project force to Africa or the Middle East, taking for granted that this was still an American interest. So I think there was little reflection on what that means for us right now, what we need to do differently, and about kind of our part of this, of the free riding and all of this. There was not a lot of debate about this. Also, Rolf Mützenich, who is kind of a leading politician of the SPD, has taken this opportunity to question the transatlantic security partnership altogether, saying, look, that shows us that Trump is not reliable. This is not the basis for a security cooperation. We need to talk about defense industrial cooperation. We need to talk about nuclear sharing. So some politicians immediately jumped on the occasion and said, this is now the time for the Germans to cut loose, at least to some extent, from the Americans. So more army go home and take your nukes with you. That was also present in the public debate. Of course, that was not the majority of the political establishment in Germany. Political establishment is very concerned and sees this as a threat, and sees this also as the reason to enhance its kind of own efforts to boost German or European defense capabilities. But at the same time, and that is just one remark, and I end with this, but to Danielle, I very much sympathize with everything that you've said, criticizing the Germans and the Europeans, and I see that, but at the same time, the problem for the past years was very often that the Germans or the Europeans tried to do something, for example, try to create the European Defense Fund or try to come up with PESCO projects, and that was not welcomed by Washington either. So over here at this side of the Atlantic, the impression was very much, okay, now we talk about strategic autonomy, maybe that was not the right phrase, I agree, but we talk about doing more. And the very moment we try to do more and we kind of want to take our destiny in our own hands, this is not going down well as well, because we got a lot of criticism because of being protectionist on all this. So I think there is also some sort of kind of double standard coming from Washington, criticizing the Europeans for not doing it enough, and the very moment they start doing it, that is not okay as well.
So there is sometimes a tendency, I think, among Americans to welcome Europeans taking more responsibility, as long as they exercise that responsibility in exactly the ways we would like them to do it.
Yeah, buy American weapons. That was how it was perceived here.
You know, I'd like to switch to our questions, of which there are many, and let me start with one that may be focused a little bit on our German speakers, but. If I understand correctly, the NATO Secretary General is going to be in Berlin this week, or in any case, very soon. What do you think the NATO Secretary General's message to the Chancellor and to others whom he meets with, including perhaps the Vice Chancellor and Finance Minister, should be on these questions of Germany's defense role and on transatlantic security? I'll leave that for Wolfgang or for Jana, if you would care to offer a view.
Okay, I'll take a shot at it. I think this is quite easy to answer. The NATO Secretary General's role is, of course, to reassure allies, all allies, beginning with the United States, about the fundamental health of the alliance. He will try to present an alliance that is not in disarray, that is okay, and that we should not make this procedure, this American procedure of changing locations and moving troops, we should not turn it into a major crisis of the alliance. Look, Jeff, I think the entire Trump administration decision, as Daniela correctly pointed out, would have been a very normal event. I mean, we've had a drawdown sequence of US troops stationed in Germany over the last 30 years, beginning, with the end of the Cold War in 1990 or the years immediately following. And that was always done in a harmonious way. The problem here is that it is seen as not being adequately consulted. And I think that is key. If the German government could have said, oh yeah, we've been discussing this with ESPER and the Defense Department for the last year and a half, and we actually agree that there should be a fighter squadron in addition to what they have in Italy because the problems are in Syria and elsewhere. Wonderful. And I also certainly agree that we do not need in 2021 X number of American soldiers in Germany to protect Germany. I also agree that it is fine if American troops based in Europe are, you know, for example, in Poland or in other countries that feel more threatened maybe today than is the case with Germans. The problem, however, is, and Daniela knows everything about it, we have something called the NATO-Russia Founding Act, which NATO so far has decided to respect. And that NATO-Russia Founding Act does not allow an unlimited number of US troops or of NATO troops to be deployed in new NATO member states. And Poland and the Baltics, et cetera, are all new NATO member states, which means that there is a limit to how far we could, if we wanted to, go in deploying our own troops, maybe including German troops along the eastern border. So simply to say, I think the lack of consultation and the way this whole thing has been presented to our publics, I think that has created the negative fallout. I certainly agree that we should not now get excited about having in Germany, instead of 50,000, only 30,000 or so troops. That's not the essence of this story. The question is, what kind of alliance are we? Do we talk to each other? Do we work out solutions together? Or are we now about, and this is of course only, this troop decision is only one decision that we're talking about right now. Are we now about sanctioning each other if we don't like what the other party inside our alliance is doing, etc.? Is our alliance looked at from the outside an alliance that looks like an alliance, or does it look like an alliance that is about to sort of fall apart or end up in disarray? That's what I am worried about. I hope we can maintain, and I'm sure that's what the Secretary General of NATO will try to present. We can present a NATO that is in decent health and that works together to the benefit of all allies, including the United States.
Jana, do you want to add anything to that?
I would hope that he reminds the Germans again that they have this special responsibility. I know that we have been talking about this for ages, since 2014, and I would also say that the German, it's not only the debate has changed, but also Germany is spending much more. That gets forgotten all the time in this 2% debate, which I think is not very helpful. So I would actually frame the whole debate differently. Wolfgang Ischinger has not talked about it, but he has made some suggestions how to have a more constructive debate about defense spending. And I think the Germans are not doing as badly as is sometimes perceived in Washington. But what I think is that in the last couple of years, the Germans have kind of pushed the snooze button a bit on defense again. We had this, after 2014, there was a lot of movement, a lot of things changed. We broke some taboos, we became more active. But since the last basically general election, and ever since defense became such a toxic topic in this coalition government, and it was hardly possible to do anything, to get mandates. It was a huge struggle, and it is to this day. I mentioned already the debate we have right now about NATO's nuclear sharing and the German role in this. But I think that also the Germans have put the defense topic a bit to sleep, and you see that mirrored in one of the things that ECFR has recently done. We have done a poll amongst the elites, the bubbles in all 27 European member states, asking about priorities for the next 5 years in a kind of European framework or in an EU framework. And French kind of policy area #1 was defense. And I mean, guess where the Germans kind of positioned it? It was number 14. And so you see the huge discrepancy, but the Germans are much more representative for the major part of the Europeans. So the French were basically alone with their kind of as the front runners, and they had no followers. So I think Danielle is right. There is this lack of appetite from not only the Germans, but the Europeans more broadly. And so I would love kind of NATO Secretary General to also kind of address the European audience and to push a bit for more engagement.
Thank you. I want to pick up on some questions that we've gotten about how a change in the United States administration might affect this. Danielle already spoke to this to a certain extent. Rachel, do you agree with Danielle's characterization that a new administration under President Biden might well choose to, might not want to reverse all of these decisions and might find actually some operational or maybe even strategic rationale for them?
Thanks, Jeff. Yes, I mean, I think I would agree with Danielle that continuity is always better, and that's what you strive for in a government transition. So I do think these changes would be looked at wholesale again. I mean, some of them actually are things that had been thought about for quite some time. So there'd been a big discussion in NATO about moving more forces south and east in and around the Black Sea. The reason that AFRICOM ended up co-located with EUCOM was because they couldn't come up with any other options. They couldn't put it in the region because how do you choose one country over another? So having AFRICOM located closer to the AOR, the two locations being talked about are Italy and Spain, there's some good rationale there. Likewise, co-locating and consolidating EUCOM and NATO planners and commands in and around Brussels can offer some benefits. Stuttgart is always very crowded and not a lot of space. So, you know, I think that there are some good things here that could be looked at. But, you know, I think there will be you know, an extra effort in the Biden administration, at least in the first 100 days, to sort of repair what has been lost in terms of signaling a US commitment to NATO, signaling that there's more staying power and fewer rash decisions like this. So I think there will be a real concerted effort to show the US commitment to Europe and NATO. That having been said, will it be a return to the past? Not necessarily. I mean, Daniela mentioned Europeans over-focus on the social compact. I would argue with everything that's going on in the United States, our economic situation, COVID, the divisions between haves and have-nots, it's time for the US to focus on the social compact. And that means less money for defense. That means Europeans stepping up and doing more. That means a President Biden who has to focus on repairing those divisions and building up the US domestically. So I think that's what doesn't change. But in terms of this particular decision, I would agree with Daniela that there'll be a review, but it won't just be thrown out wholesale.
Mm-hmm. Let me switch, you know, to a separate topic on which we've got a few questions. Germany has its own political cycle, which is about a year behind that in the United States. There will be a parliamentary election next fall. And if you look at opinion polls, at least, it would strongly suggest that there would be a different government that would take office after that. Some say it might be a black-green government, that is the CDU along with the Green Party. The Social Democrats have thrown in their lot with a sort of left-wing coalition, which would be with the Greens and with the Left Party. It's unclear whether the Greens want to go along with that, but that's a separate topic. But could I ask Wolfgang and Jana how you see this changing the politics of U.S. troop presence playing into that, the politics of Germany's election cycle?
Jana, would you like to go ahead? Why don't you take that one?
Thank you. So maybe I start with the question of NATO's nuclear sharing problem, because this is also was mentioned very often in the Q&A. So I think this is likely to become one of the most problematic issues once a conservative green government would be established. So there is a deep division within the Green Party. Nuclear weapons is very kind of, it's their founding ideology was kind of an anti-nuclear, they are an anti-nuclear movement. So to embrace this idea of nuclear sharing for them is going to be very difficult. But on all other issues, I'm much more confident that that we will find, or that they would find an agreement, and to the better, because the Greens have been moving quite a lot in recent years. They are very critical when it comes to China. They are very critical when it comes to Russia. They understand, as one of the most kind of well-known foreign policy spokespersons of the Green Party has once said, that you cannot kind of defend some people with a yoga mattress in your hand. So I'm optimistic that nuclear sharing is an issue, especially because 60 to 70% of the German population are in favor of the withdrawal of US nuclear weapons from Germany. The thing with the SPD right now, and I mentioned this already, is kind of that the SPD is, that the left-leaning wing of the SPD became more prominent in recent years and is dominating at the moment, foreign policy-wise, I would say, both the parliamentary group in the Bundestag and kind of is dominant within the party. You'll very often see an infight between our foreign minister, Heiko Maas, when he is kind of having debates with Rolf Mützenich, who speaks for the parliamentary group on these things. So I think once we would have a progressive left government in place, they would easily agree on kind of ending nuclear sharing, but then have a problem when it comes to military interventions and defense spending. But I think with the exception of the CDU, CSU, and maybe to some extent the FDP, all those parties currently have a problem with NATO's nuclear sharing, and or at least large parts of the bases have a problem. And also this whole debate about defense spending will remain very difficult. Also when it comes to the Green Party, the SPD has, the last election campaign was largely about why not spend 2% for Donald Trump. I think they haven't kind of revised this claim ever since. So,
can I interrupt for a second, Jana? Do you think an election campaign might be characterized by calls of some political parties to place new restrictions on the activities of the U.S. military from German soil? Especially given the changing public opinion that has been that we've seen in reaction to the U.S. announcements.
Well, that was already they kind of the SPD already tried in the last election campaign. As I said, don't spend 2% for Trump and frame it like this, but it didn't go down that well. I mean, foreign policy, and this is much to my regret, is not such a big issue in German election campaigns, nor is kind of the EU or the further development of the European Union. That is simply not something, most of the time, something that does decide German elections, with the exception of the Gerhard Schröder and the no to the Iraq war, which was a huge topic back then. But I don't see that. I see the attempt to do this, but I don't see a lot of support and a lot of interest from the German population. I mean, the polls are terrible at the moment when it comes to public perception of kind of the Trump administration in Germany. It has weakened in the COVID crisis a lot. We have done polls in ECFR as well showing this, but I think this is also something that can easily change back to the better. I mean, we had terrible polls when George W. Bush was in charge, but then once Obama was elected, he was kind of seen as, I don't know, the savior of Europe and the transatlantic relationship, which was also a mistake. But I think that once the President Biden would take over, I think you would see a lot of Germans very willing to kind of embrace the new administration and say, oh, thanks God, it's all over. Making the mistake to take kind of the old, kind of to think that we are good and good old Obama days, or even before.
Well, yes, go ahead, Wolfgang, please.
Can I just add a footnote to this? I totally agree with Jana, but just to be very clear about this non-interest in the context of German election campaigns in foreign policy is not a new phenomenon. It is not a new phenomenon when it comes to coalition agreements. Look at the coalition agreement that the current coalition in Berlin worked out three or 3.5 years ago. It's 170 pages, and the number of pages devoted to foreign policy issues is about as many pages as you can count on one hand. I agree with Jana. The likelihood that we're going to have an election next year in Germany, the outcome of which would be determined by foreign policy considerations, is very, very small. This election will be decided on maybe on personality issues and on many other policy issues, but not on foreign policy. And I would even go a step further. Those who may try, and I'm sure there will be some on the left wing of the SPD, or certainly within the Green Party, who will try to attract voters by presenting an anti-military, pacifist, anti-nuclear position. I don't think that that is going to draw the German voter in very large numbers. It's not going to be the kind of position that will be, you know, the winning proposition. Germans are simply, at this moment, regrettably, as a foreign policy person, I find this totally regrettable. Germans are not very excited about foreign policy. And quite frankly, when you ask why is that the case, it has to do with the fact that for the last 15 years, Germans understood more or less well that, well, there was Angela Merkel who ran the government and it was in practically pretty good hands. So why should we worry about that particular aspect of our policies? So people have gone essentially to sleep over foreign policy issues. Recently, there has been a kind of a wake-up call on European policy, on financial issues in connection with the COVID-19 crisis. But that, again, is a totally non-military issue. So even if that may sound disappointing to some of your participants, these foreign policy issues that we're discussing here are of interest to a limited number of specialists and foreign policy specialists. They are not going to be deciding the German election next year.
Okay, well, I think there we've reached our time, and so I want to thank our panelists, Danielle Pletka, Jana Puglierin, Wolfgang Ischinger, also Rachel Ellehuus, who had to leave sharp at 11 o'clock. I want to thank the ZEIT Foundation and Michael Göring and Sascha Zurka for their partnership with AICGS, and working together has been a pleasure to put this on. And I want to thank Liz Caruth from AICGS, who has been the producer of today's event. And especially I want to thank all of you who joined us for this discussion. When you get to this point, you see the numbers, you know, start to plummet as people click and log off. But let me thank them anyway. And we look forward to the next discussion. And there's still a lot to talk about. So thanks, everyone. And we will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.